Imagine, if you can, the last day of the universe. Not a day measured in hours. Not a sunrise that will never come again. But something far more gentle than that. Far more subtle. The last day of the universe would not arrive with explosions or noise, but with silence. A slow fading where nothing dramatic seems to happen at all. There would be no countdown, no final warning, no moment where the cosmos takes its last breath and everything suddenly ceases to be. Instead, there would simply be continuation. A continuation into something so quiet, so still, that it barely resembles existence as we understand it. Think about that for a moment. The end of everything, and yet not really an end at all, because there would be no clear moment marking the end. The universe would simply continue becoming quieter, darker, and more still, like a conversation that doesn't stop abruptly, but rather trails off into comfortable silence. Like music that doesn't end with a final note, but fades so gradually that you're never quite sure when the sound becomes silent. The last day of the universe would feel less like an ending and more like an endless pause, where existence gently fades rather than stops. Imagine standing in a room as the lights dim so slowly that your eyes keep adjusting. You never notice the exact moment it becomes dark. It just does. Gradually, peacefully, without announcement. That is how the universe would meet its last day. The universe would not collapse or explode. It would simply continue existing in a state so calm and empty that it feels almost unreal. A state so serene that it defies our usual understanding of what it means to exist at all. There would still be space, still be the fabric of reality stretched across unimaginable distances. But it would be a space without events, without change, without the busy dance of particles and energy that we associate with a living, breathing cosmos. Just presence, pure, undisturbed presence. And here is something remarkable to consider. The last day of the universe would not be a moment in time, but an era so long and uneventful that day becomes a poetic idea rather than a measurement. When we say the last day, we're using language that belongs to our human experience. Days measured by the rotation of a planet around its star. Days that contain mornings and evenings, beginnings and endings. But in the deep future of the universe, time itself would become strange, malleable, almost meaningless. A day that lasts longer than all the days that came before it combined. A day that stretches into eternities within eternities, where nothing marks the passage of time because nothing is happening to mark it with. On the last day of the universe, nothing would be happening. Yet the universe would not be dead, because death requires an ending point. Death is a transition, a door that closes, a heart that beats and then stops beating. But the universe in its final state would not stop. It would not transition into non-existence. It would simply be, in a way that transcends our categories of life and death, of beginning and ending. Think of it as existing in a state of perfect, timeless completion. The universe would not notice that it has reached its last day. There would be no consciousness left to observe it, no minds to contemplate the significance of the moment, no witnesses to the grand finale that isn't really a finale at all. The universe would simply rest in its own existence, unaware, undisturbed, like a painting in an empty gallery that no one will ever see again. It doesn't need to be seen to exist. It doesn't need to be noticed to be real. It would simply be there, eternal in its stillness. The last day of the universe would not close a chapter, because chapters imply continuation of a story. Chapters suggest that something comes next. Another section, another page to turn. But there would be no next, no sequel, no continuation waiting in the wings. And yet, paradoxically, this doesn't feel like incompleteness. It doesn't feel like a book with pages torn out or a film that cuts to black before the resolution. Because the last day of the universe would be complete without resolution. Let that sink in for a moment. Complete without resolution. We're so accustomed to stories that tie up their loose ends, to narratives that answer their questions, to journeys that arrive at destinations. But the universe would not owe us that satisfaction. It would not provide that closure. Instead, it would offer something else. Something harder to grasp but perhaps more profound. Completion that doesn't require resolution. Existence that doesn't require purpose or destination. An ending that isn't really an ending because the universe would still be there. Just there. And after everything that ever was, after every star that burned, after every planet that formed and every life that bloomed, after every thought that was ever thought and every love that was ever felt, after galaxies spun and black holes consumed and light traveled across billions of years, after all of that, the universe would remain, quiet, finished, and at peace, not gone, not destroyed, not collapsed into nothingness, just resting in the eternal now of its own existence. A cosmic stillness so complete that it becomes its own form of perfection. The last day of the universe, not an end, but a beginning of forever being. Finishi. By the final day, stars would have stopped forming long ago. The great stellar nurseries, the nebulae where new suns once ignited in brilliant bursts of fusion, would have exhausted themselves countless eons before. The cosmos would be filled mostly with cold, ancient remnants drifting through darkness. White dwarfs, cooled to near invisibility. Neutron stars, spinning in the void with no one to witness their rotation. Brown dwarfs that never quite became stars, now frozen monuments to what never was. These remnants would drift, endlessly, silently, through a darkness that has become the universe's natural state. Light would become increasingly rare. Think about what that means. Light, the thing we associate with life, with warmth, with hope, would become one of the rarest phenomena in all of existence. As fewer and fewer sources remain to produce it, most of the universe would sink into near-total darkness. Not the darkness of a moonless night, where your eyes eventually adjust and you can make out shapes and shadows. No, a darkness so complete, so absolute, that the concept of vision becomes meaningless. A darkness where, if you could somehow exist there, you might travel for trillions upon trillions of miles and never encounter a single photon of light. The universe would become a gallery of shadows with nothing to cast them. Galaxies would be so far apart that each one appears completely alone. The expansion of space, which has been stretching the fabric of reality since the beginning, would have carried galaxies so far from one another that they exist in complete isolation, separated by distances so vast that no light can ever cross them again. Imagine that. Islands of matter, perhaps still containing a few fading embers of what once were stars, floating in an ocean of space so enormous that they can never communicate, never influence each other, never even know that the others exist. Each galaxy would be its own universe, cut off from all others by the simple, patient work of cosmic expansion. And in time, even within those isolated galaxies, the distances would grow. Stars drifting apart, systems becoming scattered, until isolation becomes the defining characteristic of everything that remains. The cosmic background radiation, that ancient echo of the Big Bang that we can still detect today, would be stretched so thin that it blends almost perfectly into the emptiness, becoming nearly impossible to detect. That faint whisper of the universe's birth, stretched across expanding space for so long that its wavelength becomes almost infinite. Its temperature is approaching zero. Its presence becomes indistinguishable from the void itself. The universe would have forgotten its own beginning. The evidence of its birth is erased by time and distance. Most of the universe would be colder than any place we can imagine today, approaching a temperature only fractions of a degree above absolute zero. Not the cold of winter, not the cold of deep space as we know it now, but a cold so profound that atoms would barely vibrate, where thermal motion almost ceases entirely, where temperature becomes an almost philosophical concept rather than a physical reality. A cold so perfect and complete that it becomes its own form of purity. And yet, even in this frozen wasteland, something remarkable would still be happening. Black holes, once the most powerful objects in existence, would be slowly evaporating, releasing faint whispers of energy into empty space, through a process so subtle, so delicate, that it takes longer than the current age of the universe for even the smallest black hole to vanish completely. Hawking radiation, named after the physicist who predicted it. A quantum whisper from the edge of nothing. These black holes, which once devoured stars and bent space itself around their immense gravity, would be giving themselves back to the universe. Photon by photon, particle by particle, evaporating like morning dew, but across timescales that make eternity seem brief. And as they fade, they will leave behind nothing. Not even a scar in space to mark where they once were. Just a slight warming of the void. A tiny addition to the thin bath of radiation that fills the emptiness. There would be no horizons, edges, or boundaries signaling the end. The universe would simply fade into uniform emptiness everywhere. No walls, no limits, no place where you could stand and say, "Here is where the universe stops and something else begins." Just sameness, everywhere, in all directions, forever. An emptiness so uniform, so perfectly distributed, that nowhere is different from anywhere else. The universe would no longer feel vast or small. It would simply be. Vastness requires comparison, something to measure against, a sense of scale. But when everything is empty, when all distances are equally meaningless, when there are no landmarks or reference points, the concepts of large and small lose their meaning. The universe would transcend size. It would exist beyond the categories we use to understand space and dimension. It would just be, present, existing, but in a way that defies description. There would be no final silence, only the absence of sound ever needing to stop. Because silence, as we understand it, is the stopping of sound. It's the pause between notes, the breath between words. But in the last day of the universe, there would be no sound to stop. Sound requires medium, requires vibration, requires energy propagating through matter. And all of that would be so dispersed, so scattered, so still, that sound itself would become impossible. Not silent in the way a quiet room is silent, but silent in the way that silence would be the only state that could ever exist. The universe wouldn't fall silent. It would be silence, complete and eternal. Stillness would no longer feel temporary, but final in the most peaceful sense. When we experience stillness now, we know it will end. The quiet moment before the alarm rings. The pause before the next breath. The calm before something stirs. Stillness, as we know it, is temporary. A brief respite in the constant motion of existence. But in the universe's last day, stillness would be permanent. Not oppressive or frozen, but natural, complete. The way a lake becomes perfectly still when there's no wind, when there's nothing to disturb it, when it simply rests in its own existence. That kind of stillness, peaceful, final, perfect. The fading of light and stars would not be tragic. It would not be lonely. It would simply be the universe arriving at its destination. A destination that was perhaps inevitable from the very beginning. The slow return to simplicity, to uniformity, to rest. And in that rest, in that darkness, in that cold and perfect stillness, the universe would find a kind of peace that we, with our brief lives and bright stars, can barely imagine. Peace beyond time, beyond change, beyond everything we know as existence. And yet, still there, still real, still the universe, just finished. Atoms would still exist. Even on the last day of the universe, the fundamental building blocks of matter would remain. Protons, electrons, perhaps neutrons, bound in the nuclei of the most stable elements. They would still be there, scattered across the infinite darkness, but they would rarely interact, floating through space without forming stars, planets, or life again. Imagine an atom of carbon drifting alone through the void. Once, perhaps, it was part of a star, part of a planet, maybe even part of a living thing, part of someone who looked up at the night sky and wondered about the future. Now it drifts, alone, moving through emptiness so vast that it might travel for googolls of years. Numbers so large they have no meaning to us, and never encounter another atom. No bonds to form, no molecules to build, no chemistry to perform, just drifting, existing, alone in the dark. All familiar chemistry would effectively end, because reactions require energy that no longer meaningfully flows. Chemistry is about transformation, about electrons jumping between energy levels, about atoms bonding and separating, about energy being released or absorbed as molecules form and break apart. But energy requires gradients, differences, heat flowing from hot to cold, electrons falling from higher states to lower ones. And in the universe's final state, there would be no gradients left, no differences, no energy flowing from anywhere to anywhere else. Everything would be at the same temperature, the same energy level, the same state of stillness. And without energy flow, chemistry stops. Not dramatically, not with a final reaction that ends all reactions. It just stops being possible. The universe would become a place where atoms exist, but can no longer interact in any meaningful way. Any remaining particles would move so slowly that motion itself becomes almost impossible to notice. At temperatures approaching absolute zero, thermal motion nearly ceases. Particles that once vibrated with the energy of heat would slow to an almost perfect stillness. Not frozen in place exactly, because even at absolute zero, quantum mechanics ensures a tiny amount of motion, the zero-point energy that can never be removed. But motion is so slight, so gentle, that over billions upon billions of years, a particle might drift only a fraction of a millimeter. Moving, yes, but so slowly that the word motion loses its meaning. If any particles still decay, they would do so over timescales so long that a single decay could define an entire age of existence. Protons, which make up the nuclei of atoms, might be unstable. We don't know for certain, but if they decay, if they eventually fall apart into smaller particles, it would take approximately 10 to 34 years. That's a 1 followed by 34 zeros, a number so vast that the current age of the universe, a mere 14 billion years, is an infinitesimally tiny fraction of it. In this timescale, the decay of a single proton would be an event of cosmic significance. The only thing that happens in a region of space larger than our current observable universe for longer than the universe has currently existed. One particle quietly transforming into something else. And that transformation would be the only story there is to tell. The final era of the universe would be dominated not by matter, but by the absence of interactions between particles. Matter would still be there, but it would be irrelevant. What would define the universe wouldn't be what exists, but what doesn't happen. Particles that don't collide, forces that don't act, energies that don't flow, existence defined by absence. being defined by stillness. On the last day of the universe, no new physical states would be reachable, because every accessible configuration has already occurred. Think about what this means. In the early universe, matter was forming new structures constantly. Gas clouds collapsing into stars, stars forging new elements, planets forming, life emerging. Each moment brought new configurations, new arrangements of matter and energy that had never existed before. But the universe has only so many possible states it can reach. Only so many ways that matter and energy can arrange themselves given the laws of physics and the amount of energy available. And eventually, after enough time, every possible state would have been explored. Every possible configuration is tried. The universe would have exhausted its possibilities. Not because it ran out of space or time, but because it ran out of energy to create new states, to reach new configurations. It would settle into the one state it can maintain forever, the state requiring no energy to sustain, the lowest, simplest, most stable state possible. The universe would rest at the lowest possible energy level it can ever achieve. In physics, this is called the ground state, the configuration of minimum energy, the state that a system naturally settles into when left alone long enough. A ball rolling down a hill until it reaches the valley floor and stops. The universe, having rolled down the hill of entropy for countless eons, would finally reach the bottom. And there it would rest, not dead, not gone, but simply at rest, at the lowest level, the simplest state, the configuration that requires nothing to maintain and from which nothing can emerge. All remaining motion would be so evenly distributed that nothing can be distinguished as moving relative to anything else. Motion only means something when measured against a reference point. A car moves relative to the road. The earth moves relative to the sun. Galaxies move relative to each other. But when everything is moving in the same way, when all motion is perfectly distributed, perfectly averaged, perfectly uniform, then nothing is moving relative to anything else. It's like being in a river where the current is perfectly smooth. If you're flowing with the water, you can't tell you're moving at all. The universe would become that smooth current. Motion without movement. Change without difference. Every region of space would be statistically identical to every other region. No matter where you could theoretically look, no matter which direction you could theoretically travel, you would find exactly the same thing. The same density of particles, the same temperature, the same amount of energy, the same nothingness. Uniformity so perfect that location becomes meaningless. Position becomes arbitrary. Here would be the same as there. This region is identical to that region. The universe would lose its texture, its variation, its uniqueness. It would become perfectly, utterly, completely uniform. And in that uniformity, something profound would happen. The difference between stability and change would disappear, leaving only permanence. We think of stable things as unchanging and changing things as unstable. A rock is stable. A flame is changing. But both the rock and the flame exist in time. The rock might sit still for years, but it could be moved. The flame changes constantly, but it could be extinguished. Both have the potential for transformation, but in the universe's final state, there would be no potential for transformation. No energy to enable change. No gradients to drive processes. Stability wouldn't be the absence of change. It would be the impossibility of change. And change wouldn't be something that could happen but isn't happening. It would be something that cannot happen. The two concepts would merge, become the same thing. Permanence. Not permanence in the sense of lasting a long time, but permanence in the sense of existing beyond time itself. A state so stable that stability and change lose their distinction. Matter without interaction. Particles that exist but don't matter, that float but don't go anywhere, that persists but doesn't do anything. The universe would have become a collection of isolated atoms, drifting through infinite darkness, unable to form anything, unable to react, unable to change, and yet still there, still existing, still the universe, just finished with interaction, finished with chemistry, finished with the dance of matter and energy that created everything we know, resting in a state of perfect, permanent stillness, where being and not being blur together into something beyond both. The universe, at last, at peace with its own existence, needing nothing, changing nothing, being nothing but itself. Forever, the universe would no longer have a visible structure. No filaments of galaxies stretching across the cosmic web. No clusters of matter gathering in gravitational wells. No voids separating regions of higher density. Just an almost perfectly uniform emptiness. If you could somehow observe the universe on its last day, if you could take a cosmic photograph capturing trillions upon trillions of light years in every direction, you would see nothing. Not darkness punctuated by light, not structure outlined by shadow, just uniformity, sameness, a texture so smooth and featureless that your eyes would find nothing to focus on, nothing to distinguish one region from another. The grand architecture of the cosmos, which once spanned incomprehensible distances with beautiful complexity, would have dissolved into perfect, empty smoothness. By the last day of the universe, even the concept of space becomes almost meaningless, because there are no landmarks left to define location. Think about how we understand space. We define positions relative to things. The coffee cup is on the table. The moon is above the Earth. The Andromeda Galaxy is 2.5 million light-years in that direction. Space becomes meaningful through relationships, through distances between objects, through the ability to say here versus there. But when there are no objects, when there are no relationships, when here and there are indistinguishable, what does space even mean? It would still exist, perhaps. The fabric of reality would still be there, still stretching, still present. But it would be space without meaning, without reference, without purpose, an infinite stage with no actors, a canvas with no painting, page with no words, just space, empty of everything that makes it space. Distances would lose their meaning, since nothing travels far enough or fast enough to connect one place to another. Distance implies connection, implies the possibility of traveling from here to there, of light crossing the gap, of influence reaching across the void. But in the universe's final state, nothing would connect to anything else. A particle might drift for eternity and never reach another particle. A photon might travel forever and never encounter anything to interact with. Distance becomes infinite in practice, even if it's finite in theory. And when distance becomes infinite, it stops being distance at all. It becomes separation, absolute separation. The universe would be filled with unreachable places, destinations that can never be reached, locations that might as well not exist because nothing can ever get there. No signal, no matter how faint, would be able to cross meaningful distances before losing all relevance. Imagine trying to send a message across this empty universe. A radio signal, a beam of light, any form of communication. The signal would travel outward, yes. Light speed never changes. But the universe's expansion would stretch it, redshift it, dilute it across ever-increasing wavelengths. And even if the signal somehow maintained its integrity, even if it traveled for googolplexes of years across incomprehensible distances, there would be nothing to receive it. No listener, no observer, No device or mind or structure capable of detecting its arrival. The signal would cross the void meaninglessly. Information traveling from nowhere to nowhere, received by nothing meaning nothing. Communication would become impossible not because signals can't propagate, but because there's nothing to communicate between. The universe's expansion would continue, but with nothing left inside it to meaningfully expand away from anything else. The fabric of space would keep stretching. The fundamental process that has been pushing the universe outward since the beginning would not stop. But expansion only matters when there's something to be pushed apart. Galaxies expanding away from each other, that's meaningful. Matter separating as space grows between it, that has consequences. But when there's nothing, when the universe is already essentially empty, expansion becomes a process without effect. Space growing larger in a way that changes nothing. Distances increasing between particles that will never interact anyway. The universe would be expanding into a state of expansion. Growing without growing. Stretching without strain. There would be no center of the universe in practice, even if one exists in theory. Cosmologists tell us the universe has no center, or rather, that every point is equally the center because the Big Bang happened everywhere at once. But on the last day of the universe, this would become even more profound. Not only would there be no geometric center, there would be no functional center, no place more important than any other place, no location that could claim special significance. Every point in the universe would be equally isolated, equally empty, equally meaningless. If you could exist at any random location in this universe, you would find exactly what you'd find at any other location. Nothing, the same nothing, the identical nothing, the uniform, perfect, absolute nothing. Centerlessness so complete that the concept of center dissolves entirely. On the last day of the universe, size would no longer matter, because nothing exists to be larger or smaller than anything else. Size is comparative. A mountain is large compared to a person. A planet is large compared to a mountain. A star is large compared to a planet. But when there are no comparisons, when there's nothing to measure against, is a lone atom large or small? Neither. Both. The question becomes meaningless. The universe itself, is it large? How would you tell? Large compared to what? Size would fade as a concept. Not because things would stop having dimensions, but because dimensions would stop matching. An atom and the universe would be equally significant, which is to say, not significant at all. There would be no background and no foreground, since contrast depends on difference. When you look at a painting, objects stand out against the background. When you gaze at the night sky, stars shine against the darkness of space. Foreground and background, figure and ground, the fundamental way we perceive and organize reality. But contrast requires difference, variation, something distinct from something else. And the universe's final state would have no difference, no variation, no bright against dark, no dense against sparse, no hot against cold, just sameness, not a background with nothing in the foreground, but the erasure of the distinction entirely. Everything would be background, or everything would be foreground. The two concepts would collapse into each other, leaving only presence, undifferentiated presence. The last day of the universe would erase the difference between somewhere and nowhere. Right now, somewhere means a specific location, coordinates in space, a place where something is, and nowhere means the absence of location, the void between places. But when all of space is equally empty, when every location is the same as every other location, then somewhere and nowhere become the same thing. You could pick any point in the universe at random and call it somewhere, but it would be indistinguishable from nowhere, because there would be nothing there, nothing anywhere. Every somewhere is a nowhere. Every nowhere is a somewhere. The distinction would collapse. Location and the absence of location merging into a single concept that transcends both. The universe would exist in a state of maximum symmetry, where every direction looks almost exactly the same as every other. Symmetry is beautiful in limited doses. A snowflake, a flower, a face, but perfect symmetry, absolute symmetry, is strangely empty. When everything is symmetric, nothing stands out. Nothing is special. Nothing is unique. The universe would achieve perfect rotational symmetry, perfect translational symmetry, every transformation leaving it unchanged. Not because of design or intention, but because difference requires energy. And the universe would have no free energy left. It would settle into the most symmetric state possible. The state that looks the same from every angle, from every position, in every direction. A perfection so complete that it becomes indistinguishable from nothingness. Space would lose meaning not because it would cease to exist, but because meaning requires distinction, requires places that are different from other places, requires distances that can be traversed, requires locations that can be identified and distinguished. And all of that would fade, not destroyed, not eliminated, just rendered irrelevant. The universe would still be there, still occupying space, still extended across dimensions, but it would be a space without meaning, without purpose, without the qualities that make space something we can comprehend. An infinite emptiness, not the emptiness of a void waiting to be filled, but the emptiness of completion, of having arrived at the simplest possible state, of having nothing left to become. Space, at last, freed from the burden of containing anything, existing purely for its own sake, meaning nothing, being everything, the same in all directions, forever. Time itself would feel meaningless on the last day, because nothing changes anymore. No motion, no growth, no decay at a noticeable scale. Think about how we experience time. We feel its passage through change. The sun rises and sets. Seasons turn. We grow older, clocks tick, hearts beat. Time is the dimension of transformation, the axis along which things become different from what they were. But on the last day of the universe, nothing would transform. Particles would remain where they are, drifting imperceptibly. Energy would stay at its minimum level. Temperature would hold steady at near absolute zero. And without change, what is time? Does time still pass if nothing marks its passage? Does a moment differ from the next moment if they're identical? Time would become a dimension without direction, a measure without meaning, a concept that exists in theory but dissolves in practice. No natural clocks would remain, because all repeating processes, orbits, vibrations, decays, would have slowed beyond recognition. We measure time with rhythms. The Earth's rotation gives us days. Its orbit gives us years. Atomic vibrations give us seconds. The decay of radioactive elements gives us deep time. Every clock is something that repeats, something that cycles, something that moves from one state back to another and allows us to count the iterations. But in the universe's final state, there would be no orbits, no atoms vibrating in measurable ways, no decays happening frequently enough to count. The proton that might decay once every 10 to the 34 years cannot serve as a clock. The timescale is too vast. The events are too rare. And so time becomes unmeasurable. Not because it doesn't exist, but because there's nothing left to measure it with. Like trying to measure distance when you have no ruler, no landmarks, no reference points. Time would still be there, perhaps, still flowing, still progressing from past to future. But silently, invisibly, without any way to know it's moving at all. The universe would no longer age, because aging requires change, and change would have nearly stopped. We say the universe is currently about 14 billion years old. We can measure its age by looking at the oldest stars, the cosmic microwave background, and the expansion rate. But age is really a measure of how much has changed since the beginning. The universe has aged because stars have formed and died, because galaxies have evolved, because the cosmic temperature has dropped, because structure has emerged and grown and transformed. But on the last day, what would another trillion years change? Nothing. What would another Google years change? Nothing. The universe would exist in a state where time passes but aging doesn't. Where duration accumulates but development doesn't. It would be timelessly timeless, eternally present, forever finished, not frozen in time, but existing beyond the relevance of time. There would be no smallest moment of time left to measure, only continuous stillness. In physics, we sometimes speak of Planck time, the smallest meaningful unit of time, about 10 to the minus 43 seconds. But even Planck time assumes you're measuring something. Some events, some change is happening at that scale. In the universe's final state, there would be no events, no changes at any scale. You couldn't say, this happened at this moment, and that happened at that moment, because nothing would happen. Time would lose its granularity, the structure, its division into discrete moments. It would become smooth, continuous, undifferentiated, not a series of moments following one another, but a single eternal nowness that never changes and never ends. The idea of after would lose meaning, since nothing new follows from what already is. After implies sequence, causation, one thing leading to another. After the rain, the rainbow. After the question, the answer. After the night, the morning. But when nothing causes anything else, when no state gives rise to a new state, what does after mean? The universe would simply continue being what it is, not transitioning into something else, not developing into a new phase, just being. Now and after now would be identical, indistinguishable. The future would not be a different time from the present. It would be the same time extending forever. The universe would no longer have a future in the usual sense, only an endless continuation of the same state. When we think about the future, we imagine possibilities, things that might happen, changes that could occur, choices that will be made. The future is open, undetermined, full of potential. But the universe's future would be completely determined, completely known, completely inevitable, not because fate has dictated it, but because there are no possibilities left, no alternatives, no branches in the path, only continuation, the same state persisting, forever, not moving toward anything, not moving away from anything, just continuing to be what it is, an endless present masquerading as a future. Even eternity would feel complete, as there would be no sense of more time being needed. We often think of eternity as overwhelming, infinite duration stretching before us, time without end that goes on and on unbearably. But that sense of overwhelm comes from anticipation, from waiting for something, from enduring until a change arrives. In the universe's final state, there would be no waiting, nothing to anticipate, no change to endure until. Eternity would feel neither long nor short. It would feel complete, finished even though it never ends, whole even though it continues forever, like a perfect circle, no beginning, no end, yet somehow complete in itself. The universe would exist in eternal completion, forever finished, endlessly done. Every moment would feel identical, yet none of them would feel repetitive. Repetition requires recognition, the sense that this has happened before. You notice repetition because you remember the previous instance and compare it to the current one. But in the universe's final state, there would be no memory, no comparison, no consciousness to notice the sameness. Moments would follow moments, each identical to the last, but without any awareness of the identity. Like a song playing in an empty room, the same note sustained forever, but no ear to hear it, no mind to grow tired of it. Not repetitive because repetition is an experience, and there would be no one to experience it. Just sameness, pure, unconscious, eternal sameness. Existence would feel neither long nor short, only complete. Duration is subjective. A minute can feel like an hour when you're waiting. An hour can feel like a minute when you're engaged. But feeling requires consciousness, requires someone to feel. And the universe would contain no consciousness, no observers, no minds to experience duration. So it wouldn't feel long, wouldn't feel short, wouldn't feel like anything at all. It would simply be complete, whole, total, existing beyond the categories of long and short, beyond measurement, beyond comparison, a completeness so perfect that time becomes irrelevant. The universe would simply remain, without beginning again and without truly ending, not cycling back to a new beginning as some cosmologies once imagined. No big crunch followed by a new big bang, no eternal return, just remaining, continuing to exist in its final state, forever, but also not ending, because ending implies cessation, termination, a transition from being to non-being, and that wouldn't happen. The universe would remain, present, real, existing, just not doing anything, not becoming anything, not going anywhere, remaining in a state of perfect, timeless completion. Time would dissolve not by stopping, but by losing all meaning. The dimension of change would persist in a universe where nothing changes. The measure of transformation would continue in a state where transformation is impossible. Time would become a ghost of itself. Still there, still real, but no longer relevant to anything. The universe would exist in an eternal now. Not frozen, but simply present. Always present. Only present. Forever present. Without the past to remember or the future to anticipate. Just the continuous, unchanging, eternal nowness of being. Complete. Finished. At peace with its own timelessness. Forever. The last day of the universe would be governed entirely by entropy, with disorder so complete that nothing new can emerge. Entropy, the measure of disorder, the tendency of systems to spread out, to even out, to settle into their most probable state. Sometimes called the arrow of time, the one direction things always move. Ice melts into water, heat disperses into cold. Order degrades into chaos. But chaos is the wrong word, because chaos implies randomness, unpredictability, turbulence. What entropy really creates is uniformity, sameness, maximum disorder, which paradoxically looks perfectly ordered because everything is evenly distributed. And on the last day of the universe, entropy would be complete, not increasing anymore, not tending toward anything, but arrived, finished, at its maximum possible value. The universe would have reached a state of such perfect disorder that no pockets of order remain. No gradients, no differences, no concentrations of energy or matter that stand out from the background. Everything would be as spread out as it can possibly be. And in that state of maximum entropy, nothing new can emerge. Because emergence requires difference, requires energy to flow from here to there, requires something to be different from something else. But when everything is already perfectly uniform, when entropy is already maximized, there's nowhere for energy to flow, no gradient to drive processes, no imbalance to create change. The universe would be locked into its final configuration. Not because physical laws prevent change, but because thermodynamics makes change impossible. On the last day of the universe, no new information would be created, because every possible energetic interaction would have already played out. Information, in the physical sense, is created through events, through interactions, through one thing affecting another in a way that couldn't have been predicted without observing it. When particles collide and scatter, when atoms bond and form molecules, when stars ignite and planets form, Each interaction creates information, adds to the universe's history, writes a new line in the cosmic story. But the universe has only finite energy, finite matter, and therefore, finite possible interactions. After enough time, every interaction that can happen will have happened. Every possible collision, every possible decay, every possible transformation allowed by the laws of physics and the available energy. And then, nothing new. No new information to create. No new events to record. No new history to write. The universe's story would be completely told. Every chapter is written, every word placed, and the rest would be silence. Not the silence before the story begins, but the silence after it's finished. The book is complete, closed, resting on the shelf of eternity. Even gravity would feel weaker in practice, as massive structures like galaxy clusters would no longer meaningfully pull anything together. Gravity never actually weakens. The force itself remains constant, governed by the same equations that have always described it. But gravity's ability to do work, to pull things together, to create structure, to build up concentrations of mass, that depends on having things close enough to pull. In the early universe, gravity was the architect of everything, drawing gas into clouds, clouds into stars, stars into galaxies, galaxies into clusters, building structure from uniformity. But on the last day of the universe, everything would be so far apart, so dispersed, so scattered across such incomprehensible distances. Gravity would still be there, still pulling, but pulling on things too far away to ever reach, like trying to attract someone with a magnet when they're on the other side of the planet. The force exists in theory, but in practice it might as well not exist at all. Gravity would become impotent, present but powerless, existing but irrelevant. Even vacuum energy would appear uniform, with no fluctuations large enough to spark new structure. The vacuum of space is not truly empty. Quantum mechanics tells us it seethes with energy, virtual particles popping in and out of existence, tiny fluctuations in energy density occurring at the smallest scales. In the early universe, these quantum fluctuations were the seeds of everything. Tiny variations in density that gravity amplified into galaxies and clusters and the entire cosmic web. But on the last day of the universe, even these fluctuations would be irrelevant. Not because they would stop occurring. Quantum mechanics is quantum mechanics. Uncertainty remains, but the fluctuations would be so small, so brief, so isolated, and the universe would be so cold, so empty, so devoid of free energy, that these tiny variations couldn't grow into anything. They would flicker into existence and back out, leaving no trace, creating no structure, matching to nothing and no one. Even the quantum foundation of reality would be humming along in the background, unnoticed, inconsequential. The universe would not be fragile, because nothing remains that can break. Fragility requires complexity, structure, organization that can be disrupted. A crystal is fragile. A cell is fragile. A star is fragile in its own way, disrupting the balance between gravity and pressure, and it can collapse or explode. But the universe's final state would have no complexity to disrupt, no structure to break, no organization to unravel, just uniform emptiness. You cannot break what is already as disordered as it can be. You cannot shatter what has no structure to shatter. The universe would be invulnerable, not strong, but invulnerable through simplicity, like trying to break water by hitting it. The water yields, reforms, continues being water. The universe would be like that, already so dispersed, so formless, so simple that nothing could damage it, because there would be nothing to damage. No error, instability, or collapse would occur. Because instability requires imbalance, and imbalance would have faded away. Instability is beautiful, in a way. It's what makes things happen. A pencil balanced on its point is unstable. Tip it slightly and it falls. That instability creates motion. A massive star is unstable when it exhausts its fuel. That instability creates a supernova. An unstable political situation creates change. An unstable chemical compound creates reactions. Instability is the crack through which transformation enters the world. But instability requires imbalance. Requires something to be in a state that's not the lowest energy state. That's precarious. That wants to fall into something more stable. The universe's final state would be the lowest energy state possible. The most balanced configuration. The most stable arrangement. Not stable like a well-built bridge that holds its form through strength, but stable like the ground itself. Not going anywhere. Not able to fall any further. Already at the bottom. Nothing would be unstable because nothing could be unstable. Everything would already be as stable as it can possibly be. Existence would no longer lean toward decay or growth. Only balance. Throughout cosmic history, the universe has been leaning, evolving, tending toward something. In the beginning, it leaned toward growth, toward structure formation, toward complexity. Later, it leaned toward decay, toward the heat death, toward disorder. But on the last day, all leaning would cease. Not because the universe would be held in place by some force, but because it would have arrived at perfect balance, perfect equilibrium, the state it was tending toward all along. No longer moving toward anything because it would be there already, like a pendulum that has finally come to rest at the bottom of its swing. Not held in place, just finished swinging. The universe would be finished leaning, finished tending, finished evolving, at rest, at balance, peace. The universe would be immune to disruption, simply because nothing exists that could disrupt it. You can't disrupt something with energy if there's no free energy anywhere to use for disruption. You can't disrupt it with matter if all matter is already dispersed to maximum entropy. You can't disrupt it with information if all possible information has already been created. The universe would be immune not through defense, but through emptiness. Like trying to punch the wind. There's nothing there to hit, nothing to disrupt, nothing to damage. The universe would be beyond disruption because disruption requires something to disrupt, and that something would no longer exist in any meaningful form. The last day of the universe would represent the absolute limit of physical evolution. Evolution, in the broadest sense, is change over time driven by physical processes. Stars evolve. Galaxies evolve. Even the universe itself evolves. But evolution requires energy, requires differences, requires the ability for one state to transition into another state. And the universe's final state would have none of that. No energy to drive transitions. No differences to create selection. No variation to evolve from or tower. It would be the endpoint, the final stage, the last page of the universe's evolutionary story. Not a stage that leads to another stage, but the stage that lasts forever. The terminus of all physical evolution. The point beyond which no further evolution is possible. And in reaching that point, the universe would have completed its journey. From simplicity at the Big Bang through complexity in the middle eons back to simplicity at the end. A circle completed. A story told. An evolution concluded. There would be no mechanism left that could restart cosmic history. No way for the universe to begin again. No phoenix rising from these ashes. In some cosmological models, people have wondered whether the universe might cycle. Whether a big crunch might follow the expansion, leading to a new Big Bang and a fresh start. But in the universe's actual trajectory, the one we observe, there is no crunch, no collapse, no mechanism that could reverse the expansion and bring everything back together. The universe would simply expand forever, cool forever, persist forever in its final state. And in that state, there would be no mechanism to create a new beginning, no concentration of energy to spark a new Big Bang, no instability to trigger a new cycle, no hidden process waiting to reset the cosmic clock. Just persistence, eternal persistence in the final state. The universe would be finished, completely finished, forever finished, not dead because death implies a corpse, and this would not be a corpse. Not gone because it would still be there, but finished, done, complete, entropy complete, order dissolved, disorder maximized, balance achieved. The universe at last arrived at the destination it has been traveling toward since the moment of its birth. A destination of perfect thermodynamic equilibrium, of maximum entropy, of complete disorder that looks like perfect order, of eternal, unchanging, balanced existence. Nothing new to emerge, nothing left to create, nothing possible to disrupt. Just the universe, finished with becoming, content with being, at the absolute limit, at the final balance, peace with entropy, forever. There would be no observers to witness the universe ending, making the final day something that happens without being seen. Throughout the universe's history, there have been witnesses, perhaps only for a brief cosmic moment, but witnesses nonetheless. Life emerged on at least one planet. Consciousness arose. Beings who could look up at the stars and wonder, who could ask questions about where they came from and where it's all going. We are those witnesses, for now. But consciousness requires extraordinary conditions. Energy flowing through complex structures. Stars provide warmth. Planets offer stable environments. Chemistry involves building intricate molecules that can store information and process it. All of that requires a universe far from equilibrium, a universe with gradients, with differences, with free energy. And on the last day of the universe, all of that would be gone. Long gone. Gone for so long that even the memory of its absence would be impossible. No life, no consciousness, no observers. The universe would simply exist, unobserved, unwitnessed, unnoticed, a cosmic event of infinite duration, and no one there to see it, like a symphony playing in a hall with no audience. The music still exists, the notes still sound, but there's no one there to hear them. The universe would play on, but silently, alone, without a witness. Without observers, the universe would exist without perspective, meaning nothing is large, small, fast, or slow. These qualities, size, speed, duration, they're relational. They depend on comparison, on a perspective from which to measure. A mountain is large compared to a person. A person is large compared to an atom. A cheetah is fast compared to a tortoise. A tortoise is fast compared to a glacier, but without observers, without consciousness to make these comparisons. What do these words even mean? An atom drifting through the void? Is it large or small? The question has no answer, no meaning. The universe is expanding. Is it moving fast or slow? Fast compared to what? Slow by whose measure? Without perspective, these qualities dissolve. Not because things stop having dimensions, but because dimensions stop having meaning. The universe would exist in a state beyond measurement, beyond comparison, beyond the categories we use to make sense of reality. Just existing as it is, without context. If consciousness somehow still existed, if by some miracle or impossibility, a mind persisted in that final emptiness, it would experience time as endless waiting, with no events to mark its passage. Imagine being conscious but experiencing nothing. No sensations, no changes, no events occurring around you or within you. Just awareness, pure awareness, unchanging, eternal. Each moment is identical to the last. No memories forming because nothing new happens to remember. No anticipation of the future because the future is indistinguishable from the present. Just an eternal now, stretching on and on and on. It would be less like waiting for something and more like the pure experience of duration without content. Not boring, because boredom requires the memory of more interesting times and the hope that interesting times might return. Just consciousness persisting in an empty universe, aware of nothing except its own awareness. A kind of existence that transcends horror or peace, beyond suffering or contentment. Just being aware, forever, of nothing. But even this would not happen, because consciousness requires structure, and structure would be gone. If memory depended on physical processes, it would slowly fade as those processes grind to a halt. Memory is encoded in structure, neurons connected in specific patterns, molecules arranged in specific configurations, information stored in the physical relationships between things. But structure requires energy to maintain. Patterns degrade without energy to sustain them. As the universe cooled and emptied, any remaining structures would slowly dissolve. Not quickly, not dramatically, but over incomprehensible timescales. Even the most stable configurations would blur, fade, become indistinguishable from randomness. And with them, memory would fade. A mind, if it could somehow persist, would forget. Gradually, inexorably, first the recent memories, then the distant ones, then the fundamental ones, then even the memory of having once had memories, until nothing remains but a consciousness without content, awareness without anything to be aware of, existence without history, and then eventually not even that, because the physical processes that sustain consciousness would grind to a halt, slower and slower, quieter and quieter, until they stop, not with a final heartbeat, but with an imperceptible fading into stillness. All records of the universe's past would be so diluted that history itself becomes unreachable. Right now, the universe remembers its past. Light from distant galaxies shows us what they looked like billions of years ago. The cosmic microwave background preserves an image of the universe when it was just 380,000 years old. Every photon traveling through space is a record. Every pattern in matter, every ripple in space-time. The universe is filled with information about its own history. But on the last day, all of that information would be diluted beyond recovery. Light stretched to infinite wavelengths. Patterns dispersed into uniformity. Ripples smoothed away by endless expansion. The records would still exist in some abstract sense, but they would be so spread out, so redshifted, so faint, that they couldn't be distinguished from noise. And even if they could be read, there would be no one to read them. History would become unreachable, not destroyed, but inaccessible, diluted into irrelevance. The universe would lose its past, not because the past didn't happen, but because all evidence of it would fade into the background of uniform emptiness. The universe would not remember itself, because memory requires structure, and structure would be gone. We've been talking about memory as if it's just information, but memory is more than that. It's information organized in a way that can be accessed, retrieved, used, and organization requires structure, complexity, patterns that stand out from randomness. The universe in its final state would have no structure, no complexity, no patterns, just uniform emptiness. And without structure, there can be no memory. The universe would be like a person with total amnesia, not troubled by the lack of memory because they don't remember having had memories to lose, just existing in the eternal present, without the past, without history, without any sense of having once been something different. The cosmic story would be forgotten, not by anyone because there would be no one, but forgotten nonetheless, lost to the uniformity of maximum entropy. The last day of the universe would not be lonely, because loneliness requires awareness of absence. Loneliness is the pain of isolation, the ache of being separate when you wish to be connected, the awareness that others exist but you cannot reach them. But on the last day of the universe, there would be no awareness, no consciousness to feel isolated, no memory of connection to miss, not lonely, just alone. And the difference is profound. Alone without knowing you're alone. Alone without suffering from it. Alone without even the concept of not alone to compare it to. The universe would exist in solitude, but it would be a solitude without pathos, without sadness, without the emotional weight we project onto emptiness. Just existence. Unaccompanied, but not lonely, never lonely. The last day of the universe would not be tragic, because tragedy requires a witness who can care. Tragedy is a human concept, a narrative arc where something of value is lost, where potential goes unfulfilled, where what could have been beautiful is cut short. The extinction of dinosaurs, was that tragic? Only from our perspective looking back. To the universe, it was just another event. The heat death of the universe. Is that tragic? Only if someone is there to mourn it, to care about what's being lost, to grieve for the stars that will never form and the life that will never emerge. But there would be no one, no consciousness to witness and care, no perspective from which loss has meaning. The universe would simply be, not tragically, not triumphantly, just be. Beyond tragedy, beyond celebration, beyond the narratives we impose on events. Existence stripped of meaning, but not in a nihilistic sense. In a pure sense, existence for its own sake, without the need for it to mean anything. Nothing would be lost on the last day, because loss requires comparison with a past state. To lose something, you must first have it, then not have it, and recognize the difference. But the universe would have no memory of its past richness, no awareness of the galaxies that once spun, the stars that once burned, the life that once emerged. All of that would be not lost, but simply past, in a way that makes the word loss meaningless. When you forget something completely, have you lost it? Or does it simply cease to exist in your reality? The universe would be like that, not mourning its lost complexity, not missing its vanished structure, because to miss something you must remember having it. And the universe would remember nothing. The stars would not be lost. They would simply be past, in a past that no longer connects to the present. Existence would continue without purpose, without direction, and without the need for explanation. Purpose implies intention, a reason for being, a goal to achieve. Direction implies movement towards something, progress, development. Explanation implies a question that needs answering, a mystery that needs solving. But the universe's final state would have none of these things. No purpose, because purpose is something conscious beings assign. And there would be no conscious beings. No direction, because direction requires change. And change would have stopped. No need for explanation, because explanation is something minds seek. And there would be no minds. The universe would simply exist. Not for any reason. not toward any goal, not as an answer to any question, just existing, pure existence, unadorned by meaning, untroubled by purpose, unquestioned and unquestionable. And perhaps this is the most profound truth of all, that existence doesn't need to be witnessed to be real, doesn't need to be understood to persist, doesn't need to matter to anyone in order to simply be. The universe would exist without witnesses, without observers, without anyone to care that it exists, and it would be no less real for that, no less present, no less actual, just unwitnessed, unnoticed, alone, but existing, still existing, forever existing, in silence, in darkness, in perfect, eternal solitude, real without being seen, present without being noticed, the universe at last, free from the burden of being observed, free from the need to mean something, free to simply be, without witnesses, without purpose, without end, forever. On the last day of the universe, language itself would fail, because words depend on distinctions that no longer exist. Think about how language works. Every word carves reality into categories, divides existence into pieces we can name, light and dark, hot and cold, here and there, fast and slow, before and after. Each word assumes there's a difference, a boundary, a distinction between this and not this. But on the last day of the universe, those distinctions would be gone. Nothing would be hot or cold because everything would be the same temperature. Nothing would be here versus there because every location would be identical. Nothing would be before or after because time would have lost its meaning. The universe would exist in a state beyond language, not because it's mystical or transcendent in some spiritual sense, but because language is a tool for describing differences. And there would be no differences left to describe. We could still say the universe exists. That sentence would be true. But what does it mean when there's nothing to distinguish existence from? No contrast, no alternative, no possibility of non-existence to compare it to. The words would still be there in principle, but they would point to nothing, describe nothing, mean nothing. Language would fail not through inadequacy, but through irrelevance, like trying to describe colors to a world without light. The words still exist, but they no longer connect to anything real. Numbers and measurements would still be valid in theory, but no physical process would exist to demonstrate them. Mathematics doesn't need the physical universe to be true. 2 + 2 equals for whether or not there are physical objects to count. The equations that describe space and time, energy and matter, they would still hold, still valid, still correctly describe the laws governing reality. But laws without events to govern, equations without processes to calculate. You could, in theory, measure the distance between two particles. The number would be meaningful. The mathematics would work, but there would be no ruler to do the measuring, no observer to note the result, no process that depends on knowing that distance. The measurements would exist in a kind of abstract limbo, true but undemonstrated, valid but inapplicable, like a recipe for a meal that will never be cooked. The instructions are correct, the proportions are accurate, but there's no kitchen, no ingredients, no one to feed. Mathematics would persist as pure abstraction, describing a universe that has finished embodying it. There would be no final equation that sums up existence, only laws continuing to hold in perfect stillness. Throughout history, scientists have searched for the ultimate equation, the theory of everything, the final formula that would explain all of reality in one elegant expression. And perhaps such an equation exists. Perhaps we'll find it someday. But even if we do, even if there's a perfect mathematical description of the universe, it wouldn't sum up the universe's existence. It would just describe the rules. And on the last day, those rules would still apply. Gravity would still follow its equations. Quantum mechanics would still govern particles. Thermodynamics would still hold. But the rules would govern nothing. No events, no processes, no changes. Like traffic laws in a city with no cars. The laws still exist. They're still valid. They just don't matter anymore. The universe would be a perfect embodiment of its own laws, a static solution to its own equations, forever solving itself, forever balanced, forever still. The laws continue to hold, not because anything enforces them, but because there's nothing that could violate them. Perfect compliance through perfect stillness. Probability would lose its meaning, since random events require change, and change would be nearly absent. Probability is about what might happen, about uncertainty, about the various possible outcomes of events that haven't occurred yet. When you flip a coin, there's a 50% chance of heads. When a particle decays, there's a certain probability it will happen in the next second, the next year, the next billion years. But probability assumes events, things happening, changes occurring. And on the last day of the universe, events would be not impossible exactly, but so rare, so spread out in time and space, that probability loses its grip on reality. If a proton might decay once every 10 to the 34 years, what does probability mean on that timescale? If particles are so dispersed that interactions never occur, what are we calculating the probability of? Probability would become a ghost, still mathematically valid, still describable in principle, but practically meaningless, applied to a universe where outcomes no longer differ in any meaningful way, where the probable and the improbable blur together into a single, unchanging state. Even randomness would fade, because randomness depends on outcomes that can differ. Randomness is beautiful, unpredictable, the quantum flutter at the heart of reality, the dice that God supposedly doesn't play with but does anyway. Every radioactive decay happens at a random moment. Every quantum measurement produces a random result from a range of possibilities. Randomness is woven into the fabric of existence, but randomness requires possibility, options, different outcomes that could occur. And outcomes require change, require something different happening than what was happening before. On the last day of the universe, everything would be so still, so stable, so completely at equilibrium, that even randomness would have nothing to be random about. Quantum fluctuations would still occur. The mathematics of uncertainty would still apply, but they would fluctuate around a mean of zero, blip into existence and immediately back out, create no lasting effects, produce no observable outcomes, randomness without consequence, uncertainty without alternatives. The universe would be deterministic and random at the same time, both completely predictable and fundamentally uncertain, because both prediction and uncertainty require futures that differ. And all futures would be the same. The universe would no longer be capable of surprise, since nothing unexpected can emerge. Surprise requires expectation. You expect one thing and another happens instead. The unexpected guest, the sudden storm, the discovery that changes everything. But the universe's final state would be completely, utterly, perfectly predictable. Not because we would know everything about it, but because there would be nothing to know, nothing to discover, nothing to happen. If you could observe the universe on its last day, if you could see its complete state in this moment, you would know with absolute certainty what it will be like in 1 trillion years. Exactly the same. In 10 trillion years, the same. In a Googleplex years? The same. No surprises. No unexpected developments. No sudden changes. Just the same state persisting forever. The universe would have exhausted its capacity for novelty, used up all its tricks, played out all its possibilities, and settled into an eternity without surprise. Not boring because there would be no one to be bored. Just finished surprising itself. Existence would persist without narrative, without progress, and without an ending that can be pointed to. Stories have structure, beginning, middle, end, conflict and resolution, characters who change and grow. We've been telling the universe's story as if it has this structure. The beginning at the Big Bang, the middle eras of stars and galaxies, the ending in heat death. But that's our narrative, our way of making sense of things. The universe itself has no narrative. It just happens. Events occur, states transition, and on the last day even that would stop. Events would cease, transitions would end, but there would be no narrative conclusion, no moral to the story, no meaning revealed in the final chapter, just persistence, existence continuing without going anywhere, no progress because there's nowhere to progress to. The universe has arrived. No ending because ending implies cessation, and the universe wouldn't cease. It would just continue being. A story that doesn't end because it stops having plot. Doesn't conclude because conclusion implies resolution. Just ongoing existence, forever, without narrative structure. The universe would not be empty in the usual sense, but completely fulfilled in its final, unchanging state. When we think of emptiness, we think of lack, of absence, of something missing that should be there. An empty room should have furniture. An empty stomach should have food. An empty life should have meaning. Emptiness as a deficiency. But the universe's final state wouldn't be deficient. It wouldn't be lacking anything. It would be complete, fulfilled, finished. Not empty like a vessel waiting to be filled, but empty like a task completed, like a question answered, like a journey that has reached its destination. The fulfillment of arriving exactly where thermodynamics always said it would arrive. Not empty of content, but full of completion. Completely satisfied in its own existence. Needing nothing, lacking nothing, perfect in its simplicity. Nothing would be missing from the universe, because absence requires expectation, and expectation would be gone. Something is missing only if you expect it to be there, if you notice its absence, if you feel the lack, a missing person, a missing piece of a puzzle, a missing ingredient in a recipe. But the universe wouldn't expect anything, wouldn't notice any absence, wouldn't feel any lack. There would be no stars, but stars wouldn't be missing, because missing implies they should be there. There would be no life, but life wouldn't be absent in any meaningful sense, because absence implies loss. The universe would simply be what it is, completely, totally, without reference to what it used to be or what it could have been. Not missing anything, just finished needing things. On the last day of the universe, nothing needs to be understood anymore, because understanding itself has finished its work. Understanding is what minds do. We observe patterns. We build models. We explain how things work and why they happen. Understanding gives us power. Let us predict. Let us control. Let us find meaning. But understanding assumes there's something to understand. Patterns to find. Processes to explain. Questions to answer. And on the last day, there would be no patterns. No processes. No questions. Just uniform existence. Simple. Complete. Beyond the need for explanation. Not mysterious, because mystery implies there's something hidden that could be revealed. But utterly transparent, utterly simple, nothing hidden because there's nothing there to hide. Understanding would have finished its work not because all questions are answered, but because there are no more questions to ask. The universe would exist in a state beyond understanding, not above it, not deeper than it, but past it, beyond the need for it, finished with it. Meaning would fade not through loss, but through completion. Language would fail not through inadequacy, but through irrelevance. Numbers would persist not through application, but through pure abstraction. And the universe would rest in a state beyond meaning, beyond language, beyond understanding. Not tragically, not triumphantly, just complete, finished with the need to mean, finished with the need to communicate, finished with the need to be understood, existing purely for its own sake, in perfect simplicity, in perfect stillness, in perfect, eternal completion. Forever beyond words, forever beyond meaning, forever itself. On the last day of the universe, identity would lose definition, because nothing remains to compare itself against anything else. Identity is always relational. You are who you are partly because you're not someone else. A river has identity because it's distinct from the mountain. A star has identity because it's different from the void around it. But identity requires boundaries, edges, a way to say this is me and that is not me. And on the last day of the universe, those boundaries would dissolve. When everything is uniform, when every region of space is identical to every other region, when particles are so isolated they never interact, what gives anything identity? An atom of hydrogen drifting alone through the void. What makes it itself? What distinguishes it from another atom of hydrogen a trillion light-years away? Nothing in practice. They're identical, interchangeable, without unique properties that set them apart. Identity would become abstract, theoretical, meaningless. The universe would exist without distinct things, without separate entities, without the boundaries that create selfhood. Just sameness, everywhere. Everything blurred into everything else through perfect uniformity. Even the concept of survival becomes irrelevant, since there is nothing left that can begin or end. Survival means continuing to exist when you might not have, persisting through danger, maintaining yourself over time. But survival assumes risk, the possibility of ending, the threat of dissolution. And on the last day of the universe, there would be no risk, no possibility of ending, nothing that could threaten anything. The universe wouldn't survive. It would just persist, not surviving, not enduring, just being there, unchanging, unthreatenable, like asking if mathematics survives. The question doesn't make sense. Mathematics doesn't survive or not survive. It just is. The universe would be like that, beyond survival, beyond the concept entirely, existing in a way that makes the word survival meaningless. Even the concept of death would dissolve, since nothing remains that can transition from alive to not alive. Death is a transition, a threshold crossed, the cessation of processes that define life. But there would be nothing alive, and therefore nothing that can die. No organisms, no consciousness, no self-sustaining processes that could stop. Just particles, unchanging, unmoving, practically speaking, unable to live and therefore unable to die. The universe would exist in a state beyond life and death, not hovering between them, but past them, finished with the categories entirely, not dead like a corpse is dead, because a corpse implies something that was once alive, but something that never could be alive anymore. that exists in a state where life is impossible and death is meaningless. Beyond the duality, beyond the distinction, just existing, neither alive nor dead. Both, neither. The universe would exist without preference, without direction, and without intention. Preference requires valuing one state over another, choosing this instead of that. Direction requires moving towards something, having a goal, a destination. Intention requires purpose, a reason for being a certain way, and the universe would have none of these things. Not preferring anything because preference requires consciousness, and there would be no consciousness. Not moving in any direction because direction requires change, and change would have stopped. Not intending anything because intention requires will, and there would be no will. The universe would simply be, without preferring to be, without choosing to continue, without intending to exist, just existing. Not for any reason, not toward any goal, not by any choice. Existence without agency, without volition, without the qualities we associate with intentional being. Pure, mindless, directionless existence. The universe would not be waiting for anything, because waiting implies expectation. When you wait, you anticipate. You expect something to happen, the bus to arrive, the phone to ring, the dawn to break. Waiting is oriented toward the future, toward change, toward something different from the present. But the universe would have no future different from its present. No change to anticipate, no event to expect. It wouldn't be waiting, it would just be. Not patiently, not impatiently, not waiting at all. Time would pass in some abstract sense, but nothing would be coming, nothing would be approaching, nothing would arrive. The universe would exist in eternal non-waiting, present without anticipation, now without soon, just the endless continuation of the same state, not waiting for it to change, because it won't change, can't change, simply being what it is, forever, without expectation. The idea of continuation would replace the idea of survival. Survival is active, heroic even, fighting against the odds, persisting despite threats. But continuation is passive, automatic, not fighting anything, just going on. The universe wouldn't survive its final day. It would continue through it, continue past it, continue forever, not because it's strong, not because it overcomes, but because there's nothing to overcome, nothing to threaten it, nothing that could stop it. Continuation without effort, without struggle, without the drama of survival, just ongoing existence, not maintained, not protected, not fought for, simply continuing because there's no reason for it not to continue. The universe would no longer distinguish between possibility and impossibility. In a dynamic universe, some things are possible and others aren't. Possible given the laws of physics and the available energy. Water can freeze. That's possible. Water can spontaneously turn into gold. That's impossible. But possibility and impossibility are about what can happen, what might occur. And on the last day of the universe, nothing would happen. Nothing would occur. In a universe where nothing happens, what does it mean for something to be possible? Possibility becomes theoretical, abstract, a concept without application. Yes, if you added energy, particles could move. That's possible in principle. But you can't add energy. There is no energy to add. So it's impossible in practice. Possibility and impossibility would blur together. Both true and both meaningless at the same time. The universe would exist in a state beyond possibility, where the distinction no longer matters because nothing will ever actualize any possibility anyway. There would be no unanswered questions left. Not because everything is known, but because nothing asks. Throughout the universe's history, there have been questions. Perhaps only briefly when consciousness emerged, but questions nonetheless. Why are we here? Where did we come from? What does it all mean? Questions arising from minds trying to understand their existence. But on the last day, there would be no minds, no one to wonder, no one to question, and a question that no one asks. Is it really unanswered? Or does it simply not exist? The universe would hold all its secrets perfectly, not because they're hidden, but because there's no one seeking them. Not mysterious, not revealed, just uncared about. The questions would dissolve not through being answered, but through having no one to ask them. Existence would no longer ask questions, because questions require uncertainty. Questions arise from not knowing, from encountering something we don't understand and wanting to understand it. What is that? How does it work? Why did it happen? But uncertainty requires multiple possibilities, different potential answers, alternative explanations, and the universe's final state would have no alternatives, no possibilities, no multiple outcomes to choose between. Everything would be exactly as it is, could not be any other way, has no alternative configuration to wonder about. Existence would be perfectly certain, completely determined, utterly without options, and therefore without questions, not because all questions are answered, but because the conditions that create questions would no longer exist. Existence would continue not as a story, but as a single, unchanging state. Stories have arcs, development, things that happen and lead to other things, beginning, middle, end, cause and effect, one event flowing into the next. But the universe would have finished its story, finished having events, finished developing. What remains wouldn't be a story continuing. It would be a state persisting. Not the next chapter, but the same page, the same sentence, the same word, repeating not through cycles but through absolute unchanging sameness. Existence as a pure state, pure being, without narrative, without development, without arc, just this, now, forever, the same, the same, the same. Identity would dissolve because nothing would be distinct. Survival would become meaningless because nothing could end. Death would lose definition because nothing could die. And the universe would continue not as a living thing survives, not as a story develops, not as a journey progresses, but as pure existence persists, without asking itself why, without wondering what comes next, without distinguishing between what it is and what it could be, just being, indefinable, indistinguishable, indistinct. The universe loses its identity by becoming completely, perfectly, uniformly itself, forever, without question, without an answer, without the distinction between the two, just existence. Pure, simple, complete, continuing, always continuing, never surviving, never dying, just being. The universe would still exist mathematically, but physically it would feel like nothing is happening anywhere. Mathematics would still describe it perfectly. The equations would still hold. You could, in principle, write down the complete state of the universe at any moment. The positions of particles, the curvature of spacetime, the distribution of energy, all of it could be captured in numbers, in functions, in elegant mathematical structures. But mathematics is abstract, cold, perfect, and the physical reality it describes would be empty of activity, devoid of events, barren of change, like a musical score for a piece that will never be played. The notes are all there, The composition is complete, but no orchestra performs it. No sound fills the air. The universe would exist as a mathematical truth, a solution to its own equations, a perfect balance of forces and fields. But physically, experientially, if experience were possible, it would feel like nothing is happening. Not the nothing of sleep, not the nothing of waiting, but nothing of a universe that has finished doing, finished becoming, finished up, just being, mathematically describable, physically inert. There would be no final message written into the universe, only a gradual quiet where meaning dissolves. Sometimes people imagine that the universe might contain some final revelation, some message encoded in its ultimate state, a cosmic signature left by the laws of physics, a final theorem written in the arrangement of matter, a last truth preserved in the structure of space-time. But there would be no message, no meaning encoded anywhere, not because meaning was destroyed, but because meaning gradually, gently, quietly dissolved, like ink fading from old paper, like footprints erased by the tide, like memories dimming with time. Meaning would fade as the structures that could carry meaning dispersed, as the patterns that could encode information smoothed into uniformity, as the differences that create significance evened out into sameness. Not suddenly, not dramatically, not with a final erasure, just gradual dissolution over time frames that dwarf imagination, slow and patient and inexorable, until nothing remains that could carry a message. No medium to encode it in, no contrast to write with, just uniform emptiness, incapable of holding meaning, too simple to contain messages, the quiet not of silence after sound, but of a universe that has forgotten what sound is. The universe would not carry tension, as tension requires opposing forces. Think about what creates tension: a rope pulled from both ends, tectonic plates pressing against each other. Gravity pulls inward while pressure pushes outward in a star. Tension is opposition, forces in conflict, energies pushing against each other in unstable balance. And tension is dynamic, interesting, is what makes things happen. The tension breaks and change occurs. But the universe's final state would have no opposing forces, no conflicts, no unstable balances waiting to resolve. Gravity would still exist, but with nothing massive enough or close enough to pull significantly on anything else. Electromagnetic forces would still exist, but with charges so dispersed they never interact. All the fundamental forces would still be there, still mathematically present, but with nothing to push against, nothing to pull on, nothing to create tension with. The universe would exist in perfect, tensionless balance. Not because forces are carefully balanced against each other, but because they operate in isolation. Each force present but impotent, existing but irrelevant. Like musicians in separate rooms, each playing their instrument, but too far apart to hear each other or create harmony or discord. No tension, no conflict, no opposition, just forces existing without interacting, present without matching. All remaining existence would be perfectly self-contained, requiring no interaction to persist. Right now, things persist through interaction. A star persists through the balance of fusion and gravity. An atom persists through electromagnetic forces binding its electrons. Even empty space persists through quantum fields interacting with themselves. Persistence requires activity, process, things happening continuously to maintain what is. But on the last day, existence would persist without process, without activity, without anything needing to happen to maintain it. Particles would simply be where they are. not held there by forces, not maintained by interactions, just there, self-contained, self-sufficient, requiring nothing external to continue being. Like, imagine a rock floating in the perfect void of space. No gravity pulling it, no forces acting on it. It just continues being a rock, not because anything maintains it, but because there's nothing to unrock it. The universe would be like that. Everything in it is perfectly self-contained, continuing to exist not through effort or process, but through the simple absence of anything that could make it stop existing. Persistence without maintenance, being without becoming. Nothing would need to be maintained, repaired, or preserved. Maintenance assumes degradation. Things wear down, break, fall apart, and we maintain them to prevent or reverse that degradation. Repair assumes damage. Something breaks, we fix it, make it whole again. Preservation assumes threat. Something might be lost. We preserve it to prevent that loss. But the universe's final state would have no degradation, no damage, no threat, not because it's perfectly strong, but because there's nothing to degrade, damage, or threaten it. Structures would be gone. There would be nothing to maintain. Complexity would be dissolved. There would be nothing to repair, and change would be impossible. There would be nothing to preserve against. The universe would simply be, without needing care, without requiring upkeep, without demanding preservation, just existing, effortlessly, automatically, inevitably, like mathematics doesn't need to be maintained. 2 + 2 = 4 yesterday, today, tomorrow. Not because anyone maintains this truth, but because it simply is. The universe would exist with that same inevitable, effortless permanence. Existence would settle into itself, without movement and without restlessness. Settling is what things do when they find their natural state. Water settling in a glass, becoming still. Sediment settling to the bottom of a lake. Your mind settles after meditation, settling into peace, into rest, into the state that requires no energy to maintain. The universe would settle completely, totally, finally, not settling down for a rest before rising again, but settling into its ultimate configuration, the state it will remain in forever, without movement because there would be no energy driving motion, no gradients, no imbalances, no reason for anything to move anywhere, without restlessness, because restlessness requires wanting to be somewhere other than where you are. And the universe would have no wants, no preferences, no other state it's striving toward. Just settled, completely at rest, completely at peace, completely finished settling, like a lake so perfectly still that its surface mirrors the sky, but even more still, because even that lake has molecules vibrating, has thermal motion, has tiny currents. The universe would be stiller than still, quieter than quiet, more settled than anything we can imagine, resting in itself, content without contentment, peaceful without peace, still beyond stillness. Nothing would be waiting beyond the end, because beyond no longer applies. We think of endings as thresholds, as doors closing and new doors opening. Beyond this chapter is the next chapter. Beyond this life is whatever comes after. But the universe's final state would have no beyond, no next, no after in any meaningful sense. Not because time stops, but because beyond that implies difference. A change from this to that, here to there, now to then, and there would be no difference, no change, no there, no then, just this, now, here, extending forever without becoming anything else, without transitioning into a beyond. like trying to go beyond the edge of mathematics. There is no beyond. Mathematics contains everything mathematical. There's no outside to step into. The universe would be like that, complete in itself, containing all of existence, with no beyond to wade in, no outside to exist in, no after to transition into, just itself, forever, without beyond. The last day would be indistinguishable from every day after it, forming an endless, unbroken stillness. If you could observe the universe on its last day, and then observe it 1 trillion years later, you would see no difference. Not because 1 trillion years is too short a time for change, but because change wouldn't occur. Not in 1 trillion years. Not in a Google years. Not ever. Each day, if we can even call it a day, would be identical to the one before and the one after. The same particles in the same states. The same emptiness in the same configuration. The same temperature. The same energy density. The same everything. An endless succession of identical moments. Each one is indistinguishable from all the others. Not repetitive in the way a song repeats, because repetition implies returning to a previous state after departing from it. But sameness, pure, unbroken, eternal sameness. Like a photograph frozen in time. But even that's wrong, because a photograph is a moment captured from a changing scene. This would be existence that never was a scene, never was changing, never was anything but what it is. Stillness so complete that it forms an unbroken continuity. A single eternal moment stretched across infinite time. Yesterday was indistinguishable from today. Today is indistinguishable from tomorrow. Tomorrow is indistinguishable from eternity. All collapsed into one unchanging, eternal now. There would be no final silence. Only the absence of sound ever needing to stop. We've touched on this before, but it deserves deeper reflection as we near the end. Silence is powerful when it follows sound. The silence after the orchestra finishes. The silence after the storm. The silence when someone stops speaking and you wait for their next words. That silence is pregnant with meaning, charged with the memory of what came before and the anticipation of what might come after. But the universe's silence would be different, absolute, complete, not the silence after the sound stops, but the state where sound was never possible, where the conditions for sound don't exist, where sound has become a meaningless concept. Sound requires a medium, vibrations traveling through matter, compressions and rarefactions in air or water or solid material. But the universe would be too empty for sound, too dispersed, too still. Even if particles did vibrate, and quantum mechanics says they would, at least infinitesimally, there would be no medium for those vibrations to propagate through. No ears to hear them, no instruments to detect them, just the absence of sound, not stopping, not pausing, not resting, just absent, forever absent, meaninglessly absent. The universe exists in a state beyond silence, beyond sound, beyond the very possibility of acoustic phenomena. Quiet not because noise has stopped, but because noise has become impossible. The universe would simply remain. And here we arrive, at the end of our journey through these 100 facts, at the final truth of the last day of the universe. After everything we've explored, after all the fading and dissolving and quieting, after the loss of light and meaning and time and identity, after all of that, the universe would simply remain, not destroyed, not gone, not collapsed into nothingness, just there, still existing, still real, still present in whatever abstract sense existence can be said to be present. The universe would remain as a mathematical structure, as a configuration of space-time, as a distribution of particles and fields that continues to satisfy its own equations. It would remain without purpose, without observers, without change, without meaning, but it would remain. And perhaps that's the most profound thing of all. That existence doesn't need purpose to persist, doesn't need observers to be real, doesn't need change to continue being. The universe would simply remain, not for any reason, not toward any goal, not serving any function, just remaining, being there, being real, being the universe, forever, in perfect stillness, in complete quiet, in absolute uniformity. The universe is settling into its final state and simply staying there, remaining through endless time, remaining across infinite space, remaining beyond any measure we can comprehend, not surviving, not enduring, not persisting through struggle, just remaining, as mathematics remains, as the truth remains, as existence itself remains. The universe would simply remain, and in that remaining, in that eternal continuation of pure existence without event or change or meaning, there would be a kind of completion, a kind of perfection, a kind of peace, not the peace of rest after labor, but the peace of having arrived at the only possible destination, the peace of being exactly what you are and nothing else. The peace of completion is so total that even the concept of incompleteness dissolves. The universe would remain, in final stillness, in ultimate quiet, in perfect, eternal completion. And that remaining, that simple, undeniable, eternal remaining, would be enough. Not enough for anything, not enough to mean anything, not enough to satisfy anyone, but simply enough, complete in itself, whole in itself, finished in itself. The universe would simply remain, forever, at peace with its own existence, needing nothing, becoming nothing, being everything it can possibly be, in perfect stillness, in final quiet, in eternal remaining, the last day of the universe, not an ending, but the beginning of forever remaining.